Welcome to F4 Podcasts. With me is Josep Colomer. Josep is a professor. Josep is a noted author. Josep is the author of many books, and his latest book is Constitutional Polarization, which is a jolly good read. I read it yesterday. So, Josep, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here with you.
So, Josep, your book, Constitutional Polarization, makes a bold claim. You claim that the US Constitution was designed with checks, not many balances, and it was designed to be dysfunctional. Is that your core argument?
Yes. Well, let me say the United States of America was a very big experiment. Extremely innovative. I think has been successful in many aspects, of course, because it's the greatest country in the world. But to say this, they paid the novelty. I mean, they were novices because this experiment didn't have a precedent at all. So most of the world for centuries had been monarchies or empires. Then to try to build a republic in a large, diverse country, expanding up to the Pacific, that's an extremely innovative idea. And then, as it usually happens when you do something that has no precedent, I think they made several mistakes, and especially the separation of powers. We can talk a little more. And some miscalculation also, especially regarding the political parties. And then they didn't anticipate that the system would work as it does, actually. But now we are paying still. There have been a few reforms after the Constitution was approved, but we are still paying the price of this improvisation.
Paint us a picture of the time of independence. I must say your first chapter itself is a riveting read, and your first chapter is titled Democracy Was Only for Small Countries. And you point out that, yes, the Dutch had democracy, you had the Republic of Venice, and of course, Switzerland is well known. But the US set off to create its own democracy. But at that time, already it was a big country. It was 5 times the size of the UK. It had 4 million people, of which 700,000 were slaves, as you rightly point out. And so there, already at that time, the different colonies were pulling in different directions.
Well, let me clarify what's my contribution to in this book. I think because many people are familiar with the Federalist Papers, right?
Yes, they were the public propaganda.
Well, exactly.
And the public
there was a
posturing.
collection of newspaper articles in the state of New York to persuade the state legislature to confirm the Constitution. And then Hamilton and Madison contradict themselves in many instances regarding what they had said at the convention in Philadelphia. And then my point was that I had access to the debates in the Philadelphia Convention in 1787.
At the Library of Congress?
No, because they were totally secret at the time. They made a commitment, all the delegates, not to say anything about what they were doing.
For 50 years.
Until they would die.
Until they would die.
When the last one died, it was about 50 years after the convention, then they published the reports, the notes. And now there was an edition about 100 years ago with several volumes, thousands of pages, but now it's online. And then, of course, you can work wonderfully looking for whatever concept you say. Democracy, what did they say about it? Well, you see that most people said, we don't want that, that's terrible. Then you can ask what George Mason said, why he didn't vote for the Constitution. And then you can find everything online very easily. I spent many days doing that. And then is when I realized that the official version that is usually taught at schools, no? I mean, most people know about, based on the Federalist Papers, is not what the framers did. Well, it's not what the framers wanted to do, or even less what they did.
So, interestingly, I always say that all of news is fiction and all of history is mythology. And you seem to be confirming that is the case even with the US Constitution.
Yeah, well, just regarding democracy, no, that you mentioned, the idea was this at the time, is for cities, for small communities, but not for a large country. And then actually they didn't want to experiment with democracy in a large territory. They don't say this at all in the convention. What they say all the time is, at least the initial who called the meeting, was to create a stronger government. Okay?
Yes, because at the time they were fearful of the British Empire, and the British Empire was still strong. It was expanding. It went on to expand into Africa, Asia. And of course, I come from India. We were a British colony until not too long ago. And so their priority was, as you say, was to build a national defense from foreign enemies.
But the British troops were here around.
They were in Canada.
And then, 20-some years later, they invaded Washington and occupied the White House.
They burnt the White House.
It was a
1812,
Yeah, it was a real threat, actually. No, it was a real danger.
Yeah.
The Confederacy was very weak. They don't have strong institutions all across the 13 colonies, 13 new republics. And then they wanted to create a stronger government to defend themselves. Also, to pay the debt for the War of Independence, many delegates in Philadelphia had bonds from the states. They wanted to be repaid, of course. And all of them, an administration to organize all of this, and then to introduce new federal taxes. That was the idea. And then the basic institutions that they conceived initially were only a very powerful president with war powers, legislative veto, indefinite re-election, which sometimes was referred to as an elected king, plus the Senate, which was appointed by the states, was not elected as it would become much later. Initially, was just an indirectly representative chamber. And that's it. And then at some moment in the debates, that's very interesting, a couple of guys said, they warned that in the new independent United States, people would not accept again taxation without representation, as they did during the colony, right? And that's why the House of Representatives was created, was embodied as the democratic component of the government. But because they feared democracy, it was a dangerous, risky form of government, according to their view and some experiences, then they designed a series of filters and checks, that's their words, to prevent the House from prevailing over the other components of the system. And the separation of powers and these institutional checks were a cap intended to tame and temper democracy. That was the real idea.
Exactly. And so you say in your book that they had two opposite aims: to replace monarchy and to prevent democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very instructive that you quote Alexander Hamilton writing and warning people against hazarding anarchy, civil war, and perhaps the military despotism of a victorious demagogue. So clearly, the founders of the Constitution, they were wary of having a king. They just kicked out George III. But at the same time, they were wary of the mob as well.
Exactly, very much. Hamilton, you mentioned, but even Madison said democratic, I'm quoting between commas, democratic communities may be unsteady and be led to action by the impulse of the moment. And then in the past, democracies have ever been found spectacles of turbulence and contention, and as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. And many other delegates say very similar thing: is democracy is anarchy, or rather worse than anarchy, and then democracy the worst of all political evils. So I'm quoting. So several interventions that you can find in these long debates. That's exactly this. What you said is that they don't want a king like in Britain, but they don't want democracy as conceived as it is here either.
Yeah, another thing that was striking to me, and this is just the page 10 of the book, very early on, the facts you bring out are cracking. of the 74 delegates, only 55 attended. And just 39 signed the final text. So it wasn't, that was a homogeneous society in any case, but it wasn't as representative as it is made out to be, because 39 out of 74 is barely two more than 50%.
Well, the idea of this convention was basically Madison's idea. And he said when he made the first call that failed because people didn't show up, and then tried again because there was a problem of commerce between the states. And especially here by Washington, I mean, that didn't exist, the city as such, but I mean, around the Potomac River with Virginia. So there were controls by the states about traffics, etc. And then this was one of the several problems that the states, the 13 republics have, because they were not sufficiently coordinated. Okay, but they didn't say at the beginning that they wanted to make a new constitution. They said that they want to revise the Confederacy because it was too weak and needed something stronger, a stronger government. No?
Yeah.
But many of these delegates that didn't show up, they didn't want a new constitution. That's one of the factors. And the other factor is that at the time, it was not easy to go to Philadelphia and stay there for 3 months, almost 4 months, actually.
Because you had to go by horseback, you had to go by carriage, or you had to journey by boat. You wouldn't be reimbursed for your expenses. If you were a slave owner, as 25 of the 55 delegates were, then you would be neglecting your plantations. The slaves may run off. It wasn't worth the bother.
Even Hamilton, who was in New York from Philadelphia is not that far away, but still, he didn't show up most days. Once in a while, he showed up and began to speak, sometimes for hours, alone. But I mean,
he would speak alone for hours.
Was a moment that is a wonderful moment. His biographer John Chernow, who I think is a very good book, a biography of Hamilton by him. And then he tells the story that one day Hamilton showed up and began to read written notes that the historian has seen, for more than 5 hours with no interruption, that made the rest of the delegates flabbergasted. And because he was proposing that the new president would be elected for life and would have all powers, literally all powers. He said this sentence, literally, okay, and meaning executive and legislative powers, and in his written notes, as according to historian Chernow, he said he had written that would be hereditary, which means literally a monarchy. No? All monarchies have started with some kind of selection or election or victories or how no, but then he was in this case was conceived to be elected first time, but not ever again. Okay? And then he didn't read the hereditary part because he realized that most people around were not sympathetic with this idea. But still, this was. So this was that they didn't know exactly what they wanted to do, and different people have different ideas about what they were doing. And finally, but they were in a hurry. I think the intervention that I liked the most in all the 4 months of convention was at the very end, Benjamin Franklin, who was a very smart guy, of course. At the moment that they were voting, yes or not, for the Constitution, there were a few votes no, but frankly, make the speech saying there are a lot of mistakes in this Constitution. It could be improved, but it's logical because so everybody makes mistakes. But I don't want to postpone this anymore because we need a government urgently. So I'm voting yes. I think that's exactly the atmosphere at the moment. Okay,
got it. So this is how it began, and the results of that institutional design, as you point out, are friction, are polarization, and you make a very bold claim. You say that the Cold War was replaced by an internal Cold War because what needed to focus America's mind was an existential threat in the shape of Soviet Union. Once that disintegrated, instead of having a dividend of peace, you get a fragmentation, you get polarization, you get division, you get dissension, you get chaos.
Yes. So if you look, let me summarize again because we see it already, but still, the point of polarization is institutional polarization embedded in the Constitution because it's separation of powers between an executive president and a legislative Congress elected separately with only two parties, which was not anticipated. They didn't anticipate that would be parties or even less, only two parties. And then this is a design, a constitutional design that immediately produces one party most of the time, actually a little more than half of the time in the whole history. One party controls the White House, another party controls at least one chamber in the Congress, and then that's the perfect recipe for confrontation and blocking each other, right? Yeah. And then you said, that's it. Of course, as you said, there are different periods, okay? Mm-hmm. And then the point is, what I made this point exactly, when there is external threat, as it was at the very beginning, that's what the main reason why they call the convention. It was for the first 30, 40 years or so, because the first 5 presidents were members of the founding fathers, so to speak, right? The authors of the Constitution or even the Declaration of Independence, as Jefferson, Adams, etc. So all of this period was a strong cooperation among all the groups and people involved. There were no formal political parties as we conceive them now, but a strong collaboration because there was external enemy just at the door, okay? And then the second similar comparable period is the Cold War, the Second World War and the Cold War.
So once the threat of Great Britain recedes, then of course, then Americans go back to Fight Club, bish, bash, bosh.
Andrew Jackson becomes president. Yeah. Partisan politics become the main menu over the time. Mm-hmm. If you look at that period in the 19th century, I was horrified. So there was violence inside Congress. I mean, members of Congress were hitting each other, literally, having duels. So they tried to kill each other. I think not, but almost. There was a couple of famous episodes that somebody tried to kill another one. Mm-hmm. And then the other guy was out of business for a couple of years and was reelected in glory because it was kind of resurrection, something. Mm-hmm. But there were duels all the time among them. So, and then,
they must have duelled very poorly. The French, when they had duels, they killed each other. The Americans couldn't even manage to kill each other, although Alexander Hamilton died in a duel.
Exactly, but the Civil War. The Civil War didn't appear overnight by surprise. The Civil War is the culmination of several decades to 20-some years
of unsuccessful duels.
Exactly, and permanent conflict among the states and the federal country and the federal government, etc. So it was a long period that was also still more or less survival during the reconstruction. That was actually not a reconstruction, sometimes it was a restoration, etc. Right? So a long period in which the country was still in the process of building its borders, and then so the foreign policy was not significant. Okay, it was not sufficiently consistent or united. And then the war was inside. Okay, it was an internal war, so a civil war. But it was terrible. It's one of the bloodiest civil wars ever, especially for that time. But it was a long period of violence before and also after. And then the other period that comes more or less to the beginning is from the Second World War and the Cold War is about 50 years, right? In which another external threat, first the Nazis, then the Soviets, right? Which was real, of course, as well, but a real external threat. They was lived as an existential threat. And then this made the two parties cooperate, which means that the White House and the Capitol were cooperating too. And then so apparently it was not a big problem in terms of political dynamics. But the cost of this period was that two things, I think. One is that domestic issues were sidelined. They didn't talk about many social, cultural, even economic conflicts in the society because they were united about the foreign policy and the economy in general, the innovations, the technological innovations, etc. And the point that when the foreign policy is so important, the present powers become extraordinary. The present powers are reinforced, especially in periods of war. Mm-hmm. And that's why the president has become so powerful all the time. And now the fourth period would be the last 30 years. Soviet Union disappeared, external threat is not what it was, and then internal issues become the main part of the agenda that had never been solved. And then there's a conflict again, not as violent as in the 19th century, but a strong polarization making legislative paralysis, government shutdowns, president impeachments. So the system does not work as it would be expected.
So fundamentally, your argument is that in the past, bipartisan cooperation and domestic peace flourished only under a foreign existential threat. Uh-huh. So you take that threat away and the US just relapses into bish, bash, bosh.
Yeah, because this is when you see the limits and the faults of the separation of powers with only two parties is when it appears right now. No, yeah. We have how many budgets we have seen in the last few years that has not been approved on time. They have to approve provisional measures to make the government survive for a few more weeks or months until they try it again, etc. No, that's not efficient at all. That's a big disaster in terms of governance, right?
Yeah.
And then, so my estimate is that counting the first initial period against the British and the World War II and Cold War, in total, this is about 1/3 of the total time, which means for 2/3, most of the 19th century and the last 30 years now, it has been this kind of. So the system shows that it's not efficient. Okay.
Yeah. So let's look at the system. So one school of thought says, and this is the populist school of thought, it's all the problem of the evil populist nationalists. Look at these evil populist nationalists. Look at Donald Trump. He is stirring the pot. He is using advantage or taking advantage of social media with its filter bubbles and echo chambers. And what we are getting is this crazy division in American society and consequently a polarization. Your argument is that this is the symptom, not the disease. The disease is the design itself. To use it's a feature, not a bug.
So those people you mentioned, more or less, the populist, polarizing behaviors that we see every day, mostly now for the Republican side, but not always the same side, of course. Then this is always could exist. I mean, in a so large and diverse society as this, of course, there are people like this everywhere. I mean, the point is that in a different institutional system, they would not have the occasion, the opportunity, the tools able to make their point in that aggressive way and then paralyzing way. Yeah. If the system, as in a parliamentary regime, no, I mean, I think that's a comparison.
You come from Catalonia, which is a part of Spain, and in the Spanish elections, yes, it's been difficult for them to form a government, but the nationalist parties actually lost out.
Yeah, well, they have to. No, that's the point. I think my best model would be Germany. Germany is a sufficiently large country and complex country, but I think it has the best institutional formulas. Have very proportional representation electoral system that, including that permits now about 6 parties in parliament. Has increased. The number has increased, but it was 3 after the war, but now it's about 6. And then with an electoral system that permits also to select individuals, not only party lists, which is important also, and not so it's 2 things that is difficult to combine. They do, and then a 2-chamber parliament where they build broad majorities supporting the government and making legislation every time. That would be the model of good governance. I mean, no. And then here is almost the opposite because most of the time. So here the alternative is basically in the US, you have blockage between the Congress and the presidency, which means negative democracy. Because I made this point also in the book.
Yes, you do.
Because the ideas come. Isaiah Berlin, a philosopher, to talk about positive and negative liberty. But so negative means protection and positive means participation. Well, here, negative democracy means that the checks and balances are conceived in order to prevent bad laws to be approved and not to have a good performance in legislation and in governance, which would be the positive democracy, which means paralysis of many things, more issues are never solved, or, especially in periods of war, but some permanent temptation to reinforce the president, to give many powers in fact, to the president, and to make that kind of elected monarch, old-fashioned monarchy, viable. I mean, that's basically the alternative. And none of the two is a good democracy, in my opinion.
Yes, so let's get into the weeds. You point out that the design right from the primary stage as exists is fundamentally geared towards promoting the extremes, and it's not very democratic. So the figures, if I remember correctly, people get 23, 24, something like that, at most 26% of the popular vote to become candidates of their particular party. And that means with less than a quarter of the vote, you're now the candidate. And then, of course, because you just have a choice between two, you end up voting for the least worst candidate. And of course, that candidate has so much power. That candidate is pretty much like a king. Yes and no, not entirely. The Senate can oppose judicial appointments. The House of Representatives can shut off funding. The president, he can go to war. But even to prosecute a long war, as in Ukraine, his wings may be snipped if the House of Representatives decides not to sanction the money.
Well, there's two issues. No, one about the primaries that we have ahead right now. This is a kind of alternative to multiple parties. A country like this should have several multiple parties, as most democracies have, because they have proportional representation and they don't have a polarizing presidential election. Okay, but here there are only two viable candidates every district, and because the presidential election, all these two viable candidates in every state or every city must be coordinated nationally because they have to support one of the candidates for president, right? And then instead of having multiple parties, so the point is in most parliamentary regimes in Europe, for instance, and other places, in India also, for instance, so the mess is after the election. So multiple parties get representation. Usually there might not be a sufficient majority in parliament.
As in Spain, as in your country. They've had a huge problem forming the government.
And then after the election, it may take a long period in Holland as well. Holland is a very well-governed country.
Geert Wilders, who's going to work with him?
Yeah, well, now, but they have to. They have to make agreements and moderate the extremes and make those people less radical than they are because they need partners in parliament to create a majority. This may take a while. In Holland, sometimes, even before this right-wing candidate, it had taken several months to form a government after the election. Okay. But here in the US, the mess is before, because the presidential election needs simplification of candidacies before the election to make it then viable or possible winners. And then is the period of primaries that takes almost a year. And now we're having it. So it's two different formulas in order to select viable candidates for a single prime minister or president, right? But the difference is that the primaries are not as participatory as the general election. So now has increased. Since Obama's times, the number of participants in the primary elections have increased a lot. It was more passionate about that election. And now after Trump, etc. But now it's about 50-60%, which much higher than it was before, but about 50-60% of the real voters in the general election. And who are those people? Who are voting in the primaries regarding those who are not voting in the primaries, but do they vote in the general election? Well, people with stronger convictions, more passionate about politics, more radical, more extremes, okay? And then that's why the winner in the primaries might not be the most popular in the whole electorate or the most potential winner in the general election, because it's supported only by a fraction of its potential supporters. That is, 50-60% of the Republicans registered as voters, or 50-60% of the Democrats registered as voters, and now we have almost 50% of independents.
Yes.
So it means that it's a very small fraction of the total electorate that support the candidates, the winning candidates in the primaries. And then, this is what we have. We have to choose between the two of them at the general election, not selected for their electability, for their popularity, for their correspondence with the citizens' preferences, but chosen by a small fraction of the electorate that participate in the primaries. And that's the difference between this system and the parliamentary system, because in the parliamentary system, all the people vote directly to the parties. And then the parties, of course, have problems to make an agreement to create a majority. But you know that every party is supported very clearly by their voters and not by the extreme fraction of their voters.
So that's absolutely right. And the point you're making is there is a missing middle in American politics.
Mm-hmm.
The people in the middle, the independents, even the moderate Republicans and the moderate Democrats have been frozen out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is the polarization. This is the consequence. So I said, of course, the political polarization, partisan polarization, even individual candidates polarization, of course, now is what you see every day. And the center has vanished, no? But polarization means this. Polarization is just a mathematical concept, which means depends on the number of actors and their distance between each other, right? The most polarized is when you have only two actors at the two extremes, okay? Mm-hmm. If you have multiple parties, all the other parties must be in between, somehow in between the two extremes. I mean, the point is no party is going to have 50% of votes and 50% of seats in those countries, okay? Mm-hmm. Then all of them, even if the most extreme one can become the first in number of votes and seats, perhaps sometimes, like in Holland now. Well, they need support. They need additional partners. They cannot govern by themselves. They need a majority support in parliament. And here you don't. No, you can have a winner in the primary with 20-something% of the votes that they would get at the general election. Mm-hmm. And the people at the general election have to choose that candidate because there is no other one, okay, from that side of the spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. And they once they win, that he doesn't need any partner or any additional support. He can do whatever he wants because he was selected in a way by a very small minority of the total voters, but in a way that cannot be reversed. And you have to take the less bad, as you said, out of two. Sometimes it might be okay, at least when the foreign policy, I said, is the prevalent issue. But in general, there is always the risk, I have seen it recently very strongly, that a candidate with a very small support, initial support as a first preference of people, no? Mm-hmm. People, so supported by 20-something% of people who had that candidate as a first preference, then becomes the candidate, and then all the rest of the electorate have to vote for the less bad, even if sometimes are very bad.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things in your book is how this system came about as a misunderstanding of Montesquieu.
Yeah.
And Montesquieu, of course, had gone to England. He didn't speak English, and he got the wrong idea of the English system. He thought it was all separation of powers, which it wasn't. And it isn't. As you know, the Prime Minister is all powerful these days and has been for a while and is the leader of the parliamentary majority. And the framers of the Constitution, who, well, most of them weren't there. Most of them were dealing in secret, very different to what was there in the Federalist Papers, as you've pointed out. Then further took Montesquieu to the extreme and created this extraordinary American system.
I quote several times, especially in Madison, but others also in the convention in Philadelphia, saying Montesquieu is our master because he always, reading him, we always find answers to all our questions, this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Which was true in some things.
Montesquieu was a brilliant man.
Of course, yeah. No. His main book is The Spirit of Laws.
Yeah.
Is very important in political science, so to speak, political theory, because was one of the very first that make a comparison of different political regimes, different constitutions in different countries that most people didn't know anything about it, and make a classification of types of political formulas, etc. And then he spent a little more than a year in London, from France. And then what I discovered now, because I knew Montesquieu, I was even teaching, and I wrote one introduction to one of his other books, etc. What I knew that he spent all this time in London not speaking English, and so biographers and academic articles and studies in French several decades ago. So they show this very clearly. And then he was... So he relying upon one guy in particular, who was a reactionary monarchist, who had been expelled from the House of Lords because he was involved in a conspiracy to restore the absolute monarchy. Okay, and he left to France and then spoke French well, and that's why he became his interlocutor, right? And
so he was adding things and peppering the meat.
Yes, and then he sold a version that was not only outdated, but it was, even if you look back 100 years before or something, was not like that. It was embellished. This separation of powers, no? The executive king and the legislative parliament, and then they cooperate, blah, blah, blah. And then, but this didn't exist anymore at the time when Montesquieu was there. When Montesquieu published this book, at least for 40 years, Britain was already working as a parliamentary regime in which the chief executive was not the king, but was the prime minister selected by the parliament. And the king just confirmed this election. And the king had not vetoed any law for 40 years made by the parliament. And this was 40 years before Montesquieu published his book. But it was almost 80 years before the convention in Philadelphia. So they didn't understand at all the real British political system of the time, which was, as it is now, a parliamentary regime in which the chief executive is not the king, is the prime minister selected by a parliament, and the king is just a figure, a ceremonial figure that makes the thing working, but that has not any decision power at all. I think it's just one chapter that is more innovative, because I don't think this was common knowledge that Montesquieu was writing by ear over this guy.
So all this talk about the American Constitution being divine is balderdash.
Well, no, that's also funny, no? No, I think neither you or I were at high school in this country.
No, thankfully not.
then I think we don't have the previous instruction that the founding fathers, they call it fathers, also kind of exaggeration, say the framers of the Constitution, whatever, were inspired by divine law or something, right? And then
they were 10 feet tall.
They were.
I'm joking. I said they were 10 feet tall and farted thunderbolts.
Yeah, but it's not only that. I was surprised, not only now, but some previous periods, that I found some people, if I can mention one name at least, this Seymour Lipset, it was supposed to be one of the most respected political scientists and political sociologists in this country. Okay, one of his books, not so long ago, 25 years ago, okay? I quoted between commas, America...
I have it here. America felt that the hand of providence was on the young republic.
There can be a little question that the hand of providence has been on a nation which finds a Washington, a Lincoln, or a Roosevelt when it needs him. Okay.
It sounds almost like the Taliban saying Allah is with us.
Well, there are more recent quotes also in this vein in my book, but I try to refrain a little from making fun of this. But it's still floating. So, I mean, most Americans think that this is the greatest country in the world. I agree on many things. That's why I chose to be here and to live here.
Yeah, it's a great country. I mean, it's a grand and glorious country. There is no doubt. It's a phenomenal experiment.
A successful experiment. Yeah. So wonderful. But the idea that this is because was chosen by God, no, as the chosen people, which is how many other peoples in the world think sustain the same thing, no?
Of course, the Jews think they are the chosen people. The Iranians think they are the chosen people. The Turks think they are the chosen people. And of course, the French, la grande nation, they think they are the chosen people. And the British think, of course, they had the empire. They are special.
Now are in decline, but I still do. Yes, yeah, sure.
And the Spanish, I'm sure, once upon a time thought they were great. Now, of course, the Spanish have no illusions left.
Yes, no, they lost the illusion more than 100 years ago, but still some remnants. So people still believe that was a great success. But this is important in this country because it's a more powerful country now. And then the constitution is more rigid. It's very difficult to reform. There have not been amendments in several decades. And the last amendments were minor things, no? The voting age or these kind of things. No, not
That's not such a minor thing, but yes, it's relatively minor.
Of course. No, but I mean, it doesn't touch the institutional structure. No?
Yes.
It's some about rights. Of course. Yeah, there are several interesting innovations, of course, very good ones. But changing this basic formula, separation of powers, electoral system, the role of the president regarding legislation,
an overweening president with a lot of executive privilege.
Yes, the executive orders. Yeah, no? Officially, the president can veto a law by Congress. Okay, but must be override by 2/3 of Congress, which almost never happened. If it's vetoed, it's vetoed. It's blocked usually. Okay, so the president has a lot of legislative power.
Yes,
in blocking Congress, but also kind of positive legislation powers through the way of these executive orders.
Yes.
That in my calculation has been at least one as an average for 230 years, one per week.
Wow.
Which means several thousands of executive orders. All right? Many more than laws, actually. And then, as important. So because, and then the executive orders is supposed to be an administrative tool to execute the laws approved by Congress. Okay? But in practice, many of these orders include some modifications that how the law is going to be applied. So it's not that difficult to introduce mechanisms to make the application of the law somehow different from the legislature's intention. Okay, so the president is a very powerful figure, as we know. That's why he's so revered.
The president is almost like a modern day Caesar.
Yes.
What you're saying is that America needs reform at the design stage if it wants to overcome polarization.
Possible reforms that might not need a constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
So practices that can be different from what they are now.
Yeah.
That could change the working of the system in a positive way. And basically it's three things. One is the electoral system, the voting rules. There are extremely interesting experiences at the local and state level recently and expanding and collaborating a little with some of them to make the vote more open to several candidates and the winner more consensual, more acceptable for everybody, etc. That's one way that I think is quite promising. The other is the less easy, some more difficult. So the relations between president and Congress. I make the point that we have a figure that could play a more active role, which is the vice president, because the vice president is the chairman of the Senate. So there could be a breach between Congress and the White House, right? Could be perhaps more active in that work. And the third one, I think is the most important probably, is federalism. The relations between the states and the federal government has changed a lot over 230 years. And now there are a lot, probably too many tensions and conflicts between some states and the Washington government, central government, and then something could be done about it. There's one, I reviewed many sentences by the Supreme Court allocating decisions either to the federal government or to the states. And I think most of them work in a good way. But this might imply more decentralization. So if some issues become polarized at the national level, well, why not let the states legislate about it?
But you're sounding Republican now.
How you define? Because if you look back, this was the idea of Jefferson, etc. So it was the Liberal Democrats.
I mean, you mentioned the subsidiarity principle, which is very important for Switzerland and has been adopted by the EU. Arguably, it has been keeping the EU together.
Exactly. So everything that can be solved at the local or state level, don't try to be addressed by the federal institutions, right? The European Union has this officially accepted as a criterion. No? Mm-hmm. This could also, I think, diminish the conflict on many issues in the regular daily work.
Brilliant. On that positive note, Josep, thank you for making the time. A real pleasure, a real honor to have you here. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is Constitutional Polarization, published by Routledge. It's a rollicking good read. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very fun.
Bye for now.